were never meant to hear this. Not now, not ever. Not the truth behind the Ravencroft name, not the real reason those 143 bodies were hidden under floorboards like forgotten sins, and certainly not the doctrine of suffering that shaped one of the darkest corners of American religious history. But you're here now, and once you've heard what follows, you won't be able to forget it. Because the truth isn't buried, it's entombed, and something inside you has already started digging. It begins in the winter of 1862, when federal surveyors stumbled upon an abandoned stone chapel hidden deep within the forests of upstate New York. Beneath it, a silence too thick to breathe, floorboards cracked under their boots, and beneath those boards, bones, rows of them, small ones, shattered ones, carved ones. Every corpse told the same story, not of death, but of ritual. Arms had been broken, then healed. Skull fractures repaired only to be cracked again. The victims hadn't simply died. They had been prepared, slowly, systematically. The official report never made headlines. The chapel was quietly sealed, the records locked, access restricted to a clearance level that doesn't officially exist. But I have what they tried to erase: pages from the Church of the Pure Spirit, handwritten ledgers, eyewitness confessions, maps of catacombs, and one phrase that repeats again and again: through suffering comes purity, through purity, ascension. That phrase wasn't a metaphor, it was a commandment, one that hundreds obeyed, some willingly, most not. Behind this church was a family, the Ravencrofts, 3 brothers, each one more terrifying than the last: Ezra, the leader; Silas, the scholar; Caleb, the prophet. Together they turned a town into a cult, a chapel into a slaughterhouse, and faith into a weapon. What you're about to hear isn't myth, it isn't theory, it's reco. Dead, but it was buried for a reason, because knowledge this dark doesn't just change your mind, it fractures your perception. So I offer no comfort, only truth. Step carefully, because once you understand what they built, you may start to see its shadow in every institution you thought you could trust. Imagine a time before the Ravencrofts were monsters in the public memory, before the name itself curdled the air. In the early 1820s, they were simply men, 3 brothers bound by something deeper than blood, an ambition so consuming it would swallow reason, conscience, and eventually the lives of hundreds. Ezra Ravencroft was the architect of the lie. At 42, he spoke with the kind of calm authority that made lesser men bend their knees. His sermons were precise, each word delivered like a chisel, carving new beliefs into the raw minds of those who gathered in the clearing to listen. They said his eyes could see inside you, strip your pretenses away until only the terrified animal remained. Silas was different, scholarly, quiet, always scribbling in those ledgers that would one day convict them. He claimed he had discovered proof, hidden in apocryphal texts and banned treatises, that human suffering could cleanse the soul in ways no ordinary prayer ever could. He would later describe it as the science of transcendence, as though torture was an equation only he had solved. And Caleb was the most dangerous of them all. 35 years old, skin so pale it looked like candle wax. He spoke in a whisper, but when he did, crowds of farmers and widows and merchants leaned in as if drawn by invisible hands. Witnesses would later say that during his visions, his eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and his mouth poured out a language no one could translate. Some called it divine ecstasy, others suspected madness, but no one turned away. When they arrived in Ravenwood in 1825, the town was just a patchwork of cabins and half-cleared fields. The Second Great Awakening was sweeping through the region, religious fever blazing in every wooden church. The soil was perfect for what the brothers intended, a new congregation, one bound by suffering, obedience, and secrets. They bought land on the outskirts where fog clung to the trees like shrouds. There they laid the first stones of the Church of the Pure Spirit. Unlike any other church in New York, it had no windows, only a towering steeple and a door heavy enough to keep salvation locked inside. From the beginning they promised their followers not hope, but transformation, not comfort, but the annihilation of everything unworthy within them. And the people came, hungry for meaning, blind to the price they would soon pay. By the spring of 1826, the Church of the Pure Spirit was no longer a curiosity. It had become a gravitational force. What started as weekly gatherings beneath the flickering lanterns of the octagonal sanctuary evolved into a relentless cycle of indoctrination, ritual, and submission. People sold their homes, gave up their land, left behind families to live closer to the Ravencroft compound. Ezra called it casting off the chains of the world, but it was more than that. It was the first phase of psychological enslavement. Silas oversaw the teachings, delivering nightly lectures that blurred theology with pain theory, convincing followers that sin was not a moral failing, but a disease of the flesh that could only be burned away through physical trials. Caleb's role was subtler, more insidious. He began conducting private sessions with those deemed spirit-sensitive, during which he claimed to unlock past life traumas, ancestral sins, and hidden spiritual blockages. Followers would emerge from these sessions dazed, trembling, but utterly devoted. Reports from surviving journals tell of a woman named Annabelle who, after just one meeting with Caleb, gave her only son for what she called the final fire. The boy was never seen again. No one asked questions. The indoctrination ran that deep. Within a year, the brothers had created an ecosystem, a world within a world, where pain equaled progress and doubt was evidence of corruption. They issued strict dietary restrictions, forbade certain colors of clothing, and demanded daily confessions of thought. The members called each other vessels and began referring to outsiders as the unpurified. Children were taught a version of scripture that replaced mercy with cleansing and obedience with transcendence. They were told that their pain pleased the Spirit, that their blood was a ladder to heaven. Meanwhile, beneath the sanctuary, the first chambers were being carved out of the earth by hand with crude tools and fanatical devotion. What began as cellars for food and tools soon became something else entirely, a hidden world below the surface, mirroring the doctrine above. Caleb reportedly designed them after a vision he called the descending path, a spiritual architecture where each level represented a deeper severing from the self, and as the tunnels grew darker, so did the hearts of those who walked them. Suffering was no longer symbolic, it was sacrament, and the church was no longer a place of worship, it was becoming a machine. By late 1827, the transformation was irreversible. What had begun as fervent religious devotion had metastasized into something far more sinister, a living organism of control, one that pulsed with silence, secrecy, and unseen violence. The Ravencroft brothers now held complete psychological dominion over their congregation. Followers referred to them not merely as spiritual leaders, but as embodiments of the divine. Ezra as the mouth of judgment, Silas as the mind of wisdom, and Caleb the vessel of revelation. This trinity of power wasn't symbolic. It was operational. Each brother commanded a domain, and within it, no word was questioned. Ezra enforced absolute loyalty, introducing a system of spiritual audits, where members were required to report the thoughts, doubts, and misdeeds of others. Public shaming became a weekly event, confessions extracted by coercion, then read aloud during gatherings. Children were encouraged to report their parents. Wives exposed their husbands. It wasn't paranoia, it was design. Silas refined the doctrine into a series of binding decrees, doctrinal scrolls that declared joy to be a temptation of the flesh and suffering as the only path to divine clarity. His writings described the flesh as a veil of deception and declared that only through sacred trials could the soul be illuminated. These texts were memorized, recited, and etched into the minds of every follower like scripture, but they were something else entirely. Psychological conditioning disguised as faith. Caleb, meanwhile, retreated deeper into the catacombs, where he conducted rituals with the most spiritually attuned. Witnesses later described those early ceremonies as chillingly quiet, lit only by oil lamps, the air thick with incense, and silence broken only by whispered chants and the muffled sobs of initiates. It was during this period that the term elevation first appeared in church records, referring to the final stage of purification. No details were ever written explicitly, only names that stopped appearing in town. People began to disappear, but no one outside the church asked why. Fear had cloaked the compound. Ravenwood's townsfolk had grown used to the Ravencroft's ways, and those who suspected anything simply avoided the hills. The cult no longer needed to hide its transformation. The community was paralyzed by awe, fear, and the illusion of sanctity, and beneath their feet, the foundation had been laid, stone by stone, for a cathedral of pain that would soon become a graveyard of devotion. December 21st, 1829, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, marked the threshold where the Ravencroft doctrine crossed from psychological enslavement into full-blown ritualized atrocity. This date would later be referred to in coded documents as the First Ascension. What happened that night wasn't a sermon, it wasn't even a ceremony, it was an unveiling. Ezra announced to the congregation that Prophet Caleb had received a divine vision, one that would introduce the next stage of purification. Over 150 followers filled the sanctuary, their breath clouding in the cold air, candles flickering around an enormous spiral symbol carved into the wooden floor. Caleb emerged from a hidden chamber, his skin ashen, his movements unnatural, as though his limbs were no longer his own. He spoke in a high, fractured tone, a language no one understood, though all swore it moved through their bones like sound underwater. When he collapsed and reawakened, he named 3 followers, Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters. He called them worthy. Ezra declared they had been chosen for elevation. No one resisted, no one asked. That night, for the first time, pain became holy. The chosen were stripped and bound to inverted crosses on a raised platform. The congregation was instructed to chant as the brothers enacted the 7 trials. These were not metaphors, they were acts of torture dressed in scripture. First, the trial of air, water-soaked cloths pressed over the mouth and nose, simulating drowning. Then the trial of earth, buried alive in cold soil. The trial of fire brought heated metal against skin. The trial of water plunged them into freezing basins until consciousness slipped, and then came the unrecorded final 3. Witnesses could not speak of them without trembling. The victims screamed until their voices broke, until silence became their only reply. And when the torment ended, they still lived, barely. Then Caleb approached. He whispered into each of their ears. Their bodies convulsed violently. Bones cracked, blood vessels burst. They began to speak in the same strange tongue he had used earlier, and then they died. Ezra declared their flesh empty, their souls taken directly into the spirit. Their bodies were placed not in graves but in stone chambers beneath the sanctuary, where the congregation could pray to them as saints. That night, death became doctrine, pain became sacrament, and the Church of the Pure Spirit became a cult not of faith, but of submission, suffering, and holy annihilation. After the First Ascension, nothing remained the same, not in the eyes of the followers, nor in the hearts of the Ravencroft brothers. The silence of that night stretched into the soul of the compound, reshaping it. Those who had witnessed the elevation walked away altered, some with awe, others with terror, but all with unquestioning obedience. Doubt had no language left to speak, and those who considered leaving never did. Ezra declared that the Spirit had sanctioned the ritual, that heaven itself had received the 3 ascended, and that more would be called in due time. What began as an isolated event became the Church's holiest rite. The term elevation spread through the congregation like wildfire, spoken with reverence, with envy. Parents began offering their children for selection, husbands offered wives. The fear of death was replaced by the fear of spiritual unworthiness. The brothers had discovered the perfect mechanism of control, transformation through terror. Caleb's role expanded. He no longer simply interpreted visions, he issued commands. Followers began reporting strange occurrences in the chambers, members collapsing during prayer, speaking in tongues, convulsing violently. These anointments, as Silas labeled them, were signs of the Spirit's growing presence. What they were, in truth, were seizures induced by malnutrition, dehydration, and extreme psychological stress. But under the Ravencroft's guidance, suffering was always rebranded as sanctification. Below the sanctuary, the underground expanded. The single stone chamber became a labyrinth. 7 new rooms were carved, each with a distinct purpose. There was the Chamber of Silence, where initiates were kept in sensory deprivation for days. The Chamber of Trials, fitted with instruments no church should ever own. And at the heart of it all, the Chamber of Saints, where the corpses of the ascended were preserved. They were posed like icons, dressed in ceremonial robes, their faces waxed and painted to retain expressions of bliss. New initiates were led before them to pray, to touch the flesh of the once pure, to imagine their own path ending the same way. These rituals were not about belief, they were about submission, absolute, irreversible submission, through fear, through pain, through psychological fragmentation. This wasn't faith, it was spiritual engineering, every element designed to destroy the self and reconstruct it in the Ravencroft image. The Church of the Pure Spirit no longer offered salvation, it promised annihilation, and called it grace. By 1831, the Ravencroft doctrine had moved far beyond Scripture and into the realm of total behavioral reprogramming. What the outside world still saw as a religious community had in truth become a fully functional system of psychological collapse and reconstruction. The followers were no longer individuals, they were empty vessels, each stripped of identity, reshaped by ritual, and bound by fear disguised as devotion. Silas formalized a tiered structure of spiritual progression, a hierarchy of suffering. At the lowest level were the novitiates, new initiates who endured silence, labor, and surveillance. Above them, the cleansed, those who had completed initial trials and forfeited all possessions. Then came the vessels, chosen ones whose minds had cracked open under prolonged sensory deprivation and trauma, now wholly obedient. At the top were the saints, not the dead ones, but the living selected for future elevation, kept in isolation and studied like sacred specimens. Each stage required ritual degradation, each promotion required deeper sacrifice, and as the hierarchy solidified, so did the control mechanisms. Sleep was regulated, meals were rations, communication was monitored, even thoughts were policed, as members were trained to confess intrusive doubts as sins against the spirit. Children were separated from parents and raised communally, indoctrinated with stories of the ascended, shown drawings of the spiral, and made to chant purification prayers before bed. The Ravencrofts didn't just want obedience, they wanted rebirth. They wanted to engineer a generation incapable of questioning. But it wasn't enough. The rituals grew more elaborate. On equinoxes and solstices, the entire compound descended into multi-day fasts, flagellation ceremonies, and midnight offerings, where followers would write their greatest fear or sin on parchment and burn it while recited. "I am not my flesh, I am the fire." Caleb began recording his visions in what he called the Black Book, a leather-bound volume kept under lock in the Chamber of Ascension. Its contents were unreadable to most. Frantic, looping script, anatomical sketches, arcane symbols, and page after page of entries like, "The bone sings when the flesh is broken correctly." It became a sacred object among the inner circle. No one dared question it. The deeper they fell, the more they mistook madness for mystery. By now, the line between ritual and murder was gone, and no one noticed. Or if they did, they had already surrendered the will to speak. Silence was no longer commanded, it was chosen, voluntarily, desperately, worshipped. By 1833, the Ravencrofts had perfected something far more insidious than ritual. They had weaponized love, not romantic love, not familial love, but spiritual love twisted into a tool of submission. Members were taught that true love meant sacrifice, and the ultimate proof of devotion was to offer someone you loved to the spirit. What began as abstract theology became a lived nightmare. Mothers offered daughters, brothers offered sisters, and all of it was cloaked in holy language. The Spirit calls whom it will, Ezra would say, and only those brave enough to let go of the flesh truly love the soul. This doctrine shattered natural bonds and rewired emotional instincts. Pain became proof of faith, grief became a badge of spiritual maturity, and doubt became heresy punishable not with excommunication but with purification. Those who questioned, even silently, found themselves marked for internal elevation, a process that did not involve the public rituals, but instead secret, solitary trials beneath the sanctuary. Many never returned. Those who did came back quiet, changed, broken in ways that could not be described. They were not healed. They were erased. Silas began conducting private interviews with these individuals, documenting their emotional collapse in what he termed soul charts, meticulously written observations tracking dissociation, obedience, and loss of ego. These documents, later recovered by federal investigators, revealed something chilling. The Ravencrofts weren't just enacting religious madness. They were experimenting, deliberately, systematically, refining control. Caleb, meanwhile, withdrew further from daylight, emerging only during sacred events. His eyes were often rimmed with black, his skin waxy, as if he no longer slept or ate like ordinary men. He spoke less, but his words carried greater weight. Followers claimed his presence made their air heavy, and many reported fainting in his presence, a psychosomatic response that Silas interpreted as spiritual attunement. In truth, it was trauma-induced submission. The cult had moved beyond theology into the machinery of psychological fragmentation. They didn't want faith, they wanted worship carved into the mind like a scar, and they had found the perfect tools: isolation, ritual, pain, and the redefinition of love itself. Ravenwood had become a village of walking ghosts, each smiling, each obedient, each hollow, and deep below them, the chamber of saints grew crowded. The dead were not buried, they were enshrined, not mourned, admired, not remembered, worshipped. By 1835, the Ravencrofts' transformation of Ravenwood was complete, not just spiritually, but physically. What once resembled a remote religious settlement had become something more disturbing, a controlled ecosystem of indoctrination, surveillance, and silent compliance. The layout of the town itself had been altered to suit the cult's designs. The church compound expanded, now encircled by high wooden fences, patrolled not by guards, but by volunteers who believed they were protecting holy ground. Every building inside had a purpose. The dormitory of vessels, where the most devout slept in shifts and whispered spiral prayers before sleep. The house of offering, where personal possessions were catalogued and surrendered. The room of rebirth, where initiates were isolated for days without food or sound, emerging broken and receptive. Each structure was designed not for comfort, but for transformation. The brothers understood that architecture could indoctrinate. The narrow hallways, the absence of mirrors, the way windows were placed to let in light only during sermons. Every detail was a psychological instrument. Even the church bell was tuned to an unnatural pitch, low and metallic, designed to reverberate in the chest and trigger unease. Over time, these sensory manipulations worked. New members reported feeling watched at all hours, even when alone. They felt the spiral not just as a symbol, but as a force, an invisible coil tightening around the mind. The town's layout mirrored that spiral, paths leading inward, buildings curving toward the sanctuary, all converging on that central altar beneath which the catacombs lay. The Ravencrofts called it divine geometry. In truth, it was engineered disorientation. Outsiders noticed something off. Travelers spoke of a strange silence in Ravenwood, how even the birds avoided the trees near the church. Some claimed time felt different inside the compound, slower, heavier, distorted. They were not wrong. Isolation, repetition, and ritual had created a suspended reality. The longer one stayed, the harder it was to leave, not just physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and yet people still arrived. Desperate souls, lost men, grieving mothers, all seeking purpose, all drawn in by the promise of purity. What they found was erosion of identity, of memory, of will, and beneath it all, the catacombs waited, expanding, darkening, hungering. For those who entered Ravenwood, the descent was not marked by footsteps, but by silence, by surrender, by the slow forgetting of everything that once made them human. By the winter of 1836, the Ravencroft brothers no longer needed to recruit. People came to them. Word had spread in whispers, passed between broken men in taverns, desperate women in mourning, and hollow-eyed pilgrims seeking meaning in a world too chaotic to explain. They came not for sermons, but for surrender, and the brothers welcomed them not as priests, but as engineers of the soul. From the moment a new follower entered the compound, they were processed through what Silas termed the steps of unburdening. First, the stripping of names. New arrivals were assigned numbers, not out of cruelty, but out of mercy, to separate the sinful past from the holy present. Next, the shedding of history. Journals were burned, photographs buried, letters destroyed. Memory is the anchor of sin, Ezra would declare. To ascend, you must drift free. The third step was the oath of silence. For 30 days, the initiate could not speak unless spoken to by a brother. During this time, they lived in near total isolation, surrounded only by symbols of the spiral and the ascended. Meals were sparse, sleep was interrupted, chants were whispered through walls like distant winds. It was during this phase that most minds began to break, and that was the point. The fourth step was confession, not of sins committed but of fears held. Caleb himself would sit with each initiate, eyes half-lidded, whispering questions until the person before him wept or screamed or collapsed. What they confessed was irrelevant. What mattered was the surrender. Only then were they given a new name, chosen by Caleb in divine inspiration, and welcomed as vessels of the Spirit. They would never again be called by the name their mother had given them. They had been reborn, and no one beyond the fences of Ravenwood would know who they once were. Those who failed the steps of unburdening vanished. It was said they had been sent away, returned to the world to try again. In truth, some were kept in the underground, used for silent experiments. Others became perpetuals, mute servants seen but never acknowledged, wandering the compound with dead eyes and missing fingers. They were cautionary ghosts, reminders of what happened when one clung too tightly to the self. In Ravenwood, forgetting was not a consequence. It was the highest commandment. By 1838, the Ravencrofts had turned Ravenwood into a closed system, economically, socially, spiritually. The town no longer depended on the outside world. It grew its own food, produced its own garments, and even operated a small print press that distributed spiritual texts under Silas's supervision. But the real power of this system was not in its independence, it was in its total insulation. Information could not enter or leave without permission. Letters were filtered, visits from outsiders were staged. Children born within the compound were never told of the outside world except as a cautionary tale, the land of rot, Ezra called it. They were raised to believe they were the chosen remnant of humanity, preserved in purity while the rest of the world drowned in sin and ignorance. These children, the first full generation of the faith, were the Ravencrofts' greatest experiment. From birth, they were never spoken to in casual terms. Only liturgical language was permitted around them, phrases of judgment, sacrifice, elevation. They were denied mirrors. They were not allowed personal belongings. They were grouped by function, not family. Their parents were no longer mother or father, but simply the conduit through which they had arrived. Emotional attachment was considered spiritual contamination. Any sign of affection outside prescribed rituals was punished with isolation. By age 6, each child was assigned a spiritual path: scribe, vessel, sentinel, singer, or seer. Training was rigorous, not in reading or arithmetic, but in ritual, posture, recitation, and control of breath and thought. Pain was introduced early and normalized. One former member, who escaped as an adult and later testified anonymously, recalled being made to kneel on uncooked barley for hours while chanting the spiral creed. "We are not flesh, we are not fear, we are the flame." The children believed this. They lived it. They had never known anything else. Caleb took special interest in these young minds. He claimed they were unclouded by history, perfect vessels of the Spirit's design. He visited the nursery chambers often, watching them from the shadows, sometimes humming tuneless hymns as they slept. To the Ravencrofts, these were not children. They were prototypes, blank slates, a generation sculpted from silence and pain. In Ravenwood, innocence was not protected, it was redefined, not as freedom, but as obedience before memory could form. By the spring of 1839, what had begun as ritual became routine, yet no less terrifying. Elevations were no longer rare spectacles but integrated into the weekly rhythm of life inside the Church of the Pure Spirit. Sundays were no longer for sermons, they were for sacrifice. And no one questioned it. That was the most chilling part. The horror had been normalized. The congregation no longer wept during the trials. They watched in silence, eyes glazed with reverence, hands folded in perfect stillness. What would have once shattered a man's psyche now passed without reaction. Silas wrote in his journal, "True power is not in domination, it is in calibration. To make horror seem holy is to rewrite the soul." By this time, the Chamber of Saints had doubled in size. The preserved dead were no longer hidden. They were displayed almost proudly in ornate glass enclosures. Visitors, those few allowed, were told they were viewing martyrs. Children were made to pray before them. Brides were brought before the mummified remains to pledge obedience. And every elevation added to the collection a growing library of purified vessels, catalogued by date, cause of death, and spiritual function. Caleb claimed that each corpse had a frequency, and that when prayed to in the correct tone, they could reveal visions. Members were instructed to meditate in the chamber at night, alone, among the dead. Many reported hallucinations, flashes of light, sounds or voices they claimed were divine. In reality, they were sleep-deprived, traumatized, and disassociated. But no one dared say it aloud. Doubt was a poison. One whispered question could unravel your mind, or worse, mark you for elevation. And yet, somewhere in the silence, cracks began to form. Small ones, hairline fractures, a misplaced whisper, a sleepless stare. The human mind, even when broken, retains some whisper of self, and in a few members, that whisper had become a scream. Margaret Vellum, a vessel for 9 years, began keeping secrets, tiny acts of rebellion, a mirror shard hidden in her sleeve, a name whispered into the dark, her birth name, a seed of memory buried in forbidden soil, and from that seed, something dangerous began to grow. Not hope, not resistance, but clarity. The clarity of a soul waking up inside a prison it helped build. The first spark of fire inside a house drenched in oil. Margaret Vellum's awakening did not come with a scream, it came in a whisper. A single moment at the end of a long ritual when she reached out to close the eyes of a newly elevated vessel and found herself hesitating, not from fear, from familiarity. She knew that face, not from scripture or dream, but from childhood, long before Ravenwood. A boy named Elias, who used to chase frogs by the creek in her old village. She hadn't remembered him until that moment, until she saw his mouth frozen in final agony, until the spiral etched on his forehead called something buried inside her back to life. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she returned to the Chamber of Saints alone, under the pretense of prayer. She moved carefully, past the glass caskets, past the statues of preserved martyrs, until she found Elias's body again. She traced the edges of the spiral carved into his flesh and then into her own memory. The dam broke. Images poured through. Her parents, her brother, her name, her voice before silence was commanded. She wept, not from grief but from remembering, and she was not alone. Over the coming weeks, Margaret began to recognize it in others. The way Samuel, the water-bearer, lingered too long outside the chamber door, the way Sister Elra twitched during the Purification hymns. The small human ticks that obedience could not erase. Doubt had taken root, and the Ravencrofts, despite their control, had grown arrogant. They had stopped watching closely, believing their system was flawless. That arrogance was their first mistake. Margaret began leaving messages, tiny, almost imperceptible symbols, etched beneath the water pails, scratched into the backs of pews, hidden inside the folds of sacred robes. She called them counter-spirals, symbols of reversal. Unraveling, a code only the waking would see. Slowly others began to respond. A nod during morning prayers. AF. Inga tapped 3 times against a wooden bench. Signals. Language. A secret web of remembrance forming in the heart of the cult. Not rebellion, not yet, but recognition. The quiet admission that they were not fully erased, that the self, the soul, could survive even this, that there was still something left inside worth saving. And in that realization, Margaret felt something she had not known in a decade. Power. Silent. Patient. And waiting. By late 1839, Margaret Vellum's counter-spirals had spread like invisible cracks beneath marble, unseen by the eye, but threatening collapse from within. The Church of the Pure Spirit still functioned outwardly with precision, still performed its rituals, still echoed with hymns of suffering and salvation. But among the faithful, something had shifted. The chants grew quieter, eyes darted, pauses crept into recitations where once there had been flow. Silence, once sacred, now hummed with uncertainty. Caleb noticed first. He sensed disruption, not in words, but in vibration. He claimed the spirits had grown restless, that unpurified frequencies were corrupting the sanctuary. He ordered new rituals of re-cleansing, prolonged fasts, isolation chambers, forced public confessions. Some who had quietly begun to remember were broken again, others disappeared. But Margaret and her growing circle moved more carefully now. They began forming spiral shadows, pairs of followers who would mirror obedience in public, but quietly reinforce each other's memory in private. A glance, a gesture, a verse rewritten backward in the margins of a prayer book. Samuel devised a method of silent communication using pressure points during ritual hand clasps. Ezra began transcribing forbidden memories on parchment made from bleached prayer sheets folded into the hems of ceremonial robes. And still, the Ravencrofts remained unaware. Their belief in the perfection of their system blinded them. They had created a machine so focused on visible obedience that it no longer detected internal fractures. But one did notice. A child. Miriam, daughter of 2 high-ranking vessels, only 11 years old, born within the church walls. She had never known the outside world, but she saw more than the brothers imagined. She watched Margaret when no one else did. She followed her in the night, and one morning, she approached Margaret during water collection and whispered, "I know you're not asleep like the others." Margaret froze, but Miriam smiled. "Don't worry," she said. "I dream too." That was when Margaret realized the next phase of awakening had already begun, not through rebellion, through inheritance. These children, raised in silence, shaped by pain, had begun forming thoughts they were never taught to think, ideas outside the spiral. And if even one of them could dream differently, then perhaps the entire system, for all its cruelty, was not unbreakable. It was only deeply cracked, and cracks, given time, split stone. The first true rupture came not with fire or force, but with a question, spoken aloud during a ceremony, when silence was law. It was Miriam, the child with wide eyes and a voice too calm for her age, who turned to Prophet Caleb during a midwinter ascension and asked, "Why does the Spirit only ever speak through pain?" The words sliced through the sanctuary like a knife through cloth. Everything stopped. The chanting, the movement, even the breath of those gathered. Caleb turned to her slowly, his eyes wide, his mouth twitching with a smile that didn't reach his face. "Because purity is found only in suffering," he said, his voice low and measured. "You were taught this." Miriam nodded. "Yes, but who taught the Spirit?" That was the moment. small, quiet, and nearly forgotten by those who feared remembering, that planted the seed of collapse. A child had challenged doctrine, and the sky did not fall, the ground did not open, she was not struck down. That night, Margaret held her breath, waiting for Miriam to disappear. But she didn't. Instead, Caleb summoned the child to his private chamber for what was described as correction through revelation. She returned 2 hours later, her feet unsteady, her face unreadable. She spoke no words, but the next morning she joined Margaret at water duty and whispered only one sentence: "He's afraid of us." That truth spread faster than any doctrine ever had, because it was dangerous and freeing. The idea that the prophet, the untouchable conduit of the divine, feared a question, feared a child, meant his power was not divine at all. It was performative, conditional, breakable. In the days that followed, more spiral shadows came forward, not just remembering who they were, but daring to believe the Ravencrofts could bleed. That maybe their empire of suffering wasn't invincible, that maybe it was terrified of being seen for what it was, a cage, a theater of cruelty dressed in scripture. Margaret began writing by firelight, drafting what she called the Book of Unbinding, a secret doctrine for the waking. It didn't speak of gods or purity, it spoke of choice, memory, identity. It was not a rebellion yet, but it was a map, a mirror, a weapon, and every word written in it was a step away from the spiral. It began with a missing relic. One of the oldest mummified saints, Brother Matthias, vanished from the Chamber of Saints without a trace. No broken locks, no disturbed dust, no signs of forced entry. The body, preserved since 1831, was simply gone. Panic rippled through the inner sanctum. Prophet Caleb declared it a spiritual theft, a desecration by unseen forces, a test from the spirit itself. But behind the scenes, the brothers were shaken. This was not symbolic, it was strategic, a direct act against their control, and they had no idea who was responsible. That terrified them, because they realized finally that someone inside their perfect machine had learned to operate in silence, a predator among the sheep. In truth, the body hadn't been destroyed. It had been buried, secretly at night, by Samuel and Ezra, beneath the roots of the old willow tree near the boundary wall. A burial without scripture, without candles, without permission. Just soil, silence, and a stolen name whispered back to the earth. A reclamation. It wasn't meant as an attack, it was meant as mercy. But to the Ravencrofts, it was a declaration of war. They doubled security, random inspections, increased interrogations. The rituals became longer, harsher. Elevations rose in frequency, sometimes 2 in a week. Fear returned like a storm, and for a moment, the spiral seemed to tighten again. Some of the waking broke under pressure. A few disappeared. Others confessed to sins they hadn't committed just to prove their loyalty. But Margaret didn't flinch. Not now. Not after so many had remembered. Instead, she accelerated. The Book of Unbinding grew, now passed in fragments among the spiral shadows, hidden inside hollowed hymnals, written between the lines of prayer books, each verse a reminder: you are not your pain, you are not their voice, you are not what they made you forget, and more importantly, you can choose. The word became sacred. Choice. A single crack in the concrete theology of the pure spirit, and with each passing day, that word grew heavier, sharper, more dangerous. Caleb felt it. He began speaking in tongues more frequently, his visions more erratic. Elder Ezra issued warnings of spiritual infection. Deacon Silas restructured sermons to focus on obedience, but they were too late. The infection was already inside them, not sickness, clarity, and clarity, once seeded, cannot be exorcised. The next rupture came not from the inside, but from the edge, the arrival of an outsider. A man named Elias Granger, posing as a wandering preacher from Pennsylvania, arrived at the gates of the church compound one grey autumn morning. Tall, soft-spoken, draped in worn clergy robes, he requested audience with Elder Ezra, citing a vision that had drawn him north. Ordinarily, such strangers were turned away or observed from a distance. but something in his manner, calm, deferential, devout, appealed to the Ravencroft's vanity. They allowed him access. Over the course of several days, Granger moved quietly through the compound, participating in prayers, sharing meals, listening intently. He asked questions, but never too many. He seemed deeply moved by the purity doctrine, and yet something about him set Margaret on edge. It was in the way he lingered near the children, or how he studied the underground passages without ever seeming lost. When she observed him alone one night, eyes closed, hand pressed gently against the stone walls of the Chamber of Trials, she knew. He wasn't lost. He was mapping. Granger was no preacher. He was an observer, a spy. And while she couldn't prove it, Margaret suspected the Ravencrofts knew as well. They just didn't care. To them, their power was unshakable, the purity of their system beyond scrutiny. Even if he was a spy, they believed they could convert or control him. But Margaret saw the truth. They were slipping. Their arrogance had grown so vast, they now mistook rot for strength. That night, Margaret took a risk. She approached Granger beneath the cloak of moonlight, under the old willow where Matthias had been buried. She didn't introduce herself. She only said, "If you're here to stop them, you're too late. But if you're here to listen, I have a story you need to carry." Granger didn't answer. He only nodded once, solemnly. And in that moment, Margaret knew this man was not here to rescue them. He was here to witness, to survive what others had not, and to speak when they could not. The Church of the Pure Spirit, once obsessed with silence, had finally birthed its own destroyer, not in rebellion, in memory, and memory, when spoken, becomes weapon. It took 3 more days for Elias Granger to make contact again. During that time he vanished from sermons, skipped a purification rite, and was nearly reported by a devout vessel named Clara, who had grown suspicious of his silence. But Margaret intervened. She told Clara that Granger was undergoing silent discernment, a phrase used for those in spiritual testing. The excuse worked, barely. On the 4th night, Granger appeared inside the candle room beneath the sanctuary, where Margaret waited alone. He spoke first, voice low, steady. "I'm not who they think I am." Margaret nodded. "I know." Then she handed him a scrap of parchment, ink faded but still legible, the final page of the Book of Unbinding. "Take it," she said. "If we don't survive this, someone must." Granger didn't ask questions. He read the verses in silence, then folded the paper into a hidden compartment in his coat lining. What he told her next shattered the last illusion of distance between their two worlds. He wasn't from Pennsylvania. He wasn't clergy. He was a field agent for a covert division of the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, a department known more for financial crimes than spiritual horror. He had been tracking illicit shipments, bodies listed as anatomical specimens, linking medical schools in Albany and Baltimore to the Church of the Pure Spirit. The financial trail led to Deacon Silas, but what Granger found in Ravenwood went far beyond black market cadavers. "This isn't a fraud investigation anymore," he said. "This is something else, something older, something built to erase the self." Margaret laughed, bitter and hollow. "You finally understand." Granger leaned closer. "But they don't suspect me yet. That's our advantage. I need names, proof, something undeniable." Margaret hesitated, then gave him a list. 7 names, 7 elevations scheduled over the next lunar cycle. 3 owed. Of them children. Granger's hands tightened into fists. "No more," he said. "We end it now." But Margaret stopped him. "If you strike too soon, you'll just disappear like the others. You want to collapse the system? Let it show its full face. Let it expose itself. That's the only way people will believe." Granger nodded again, slower this time. He understood. Exposure was the weapon, truth, the contagion, and once unleashed, it would spread faster than any gospel. The spiral tightened one last time before it broke. The Ravencrofts, sensing a disturbance they could not name, escalated everything. Elevations were no longer monthly. They became weekly. Pain became pageantry. The trials, once performed in secret chambers, were now broadcast to the entire congregation. No more shadows, no more whispers. It was power laid bare. "The Spirit demands visibility," Elder Ezra declared. "We must no longer hide the truth of transformation." But Margaret saw through it. This wasn't revelation. It was desperation, control slipping through their hands, masked in ritual. She watched as Prophet Caleb's sermons devolved into manic screaming, his tongue thick with false languages, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and chemical ingestion. His body, once revered, now trembled uncontrollably during ceremonies. Children began to cry, not in reverence, but in fear. Parents comforted them by reciting obedience prayers, but even those began to fray. A crack was forming, not loud, not sudden, but steady, relentless. Granger continued his work from inside the cult, collecting pages of ledgers, copied rituals, even burial locations. He transmitted coded messages through postal drops disguised as scripture mailings, small, hidden truths slipped into the machinery of the state. Meanwhile, Margaret moved among the faithful like a ghost. She planted doubts with surgical precision. A whispered word here, a question posed during a vigil, a look exchanged during the trial of fire, each act imperceptible, each one fatal to doctrine. And then, one night, the Ravencrofts made their fatal mistake. A girl, barely 13, collapsed during the 5th trial, her body convulsed, foam pooling at her lips. Prophet Caleb demanded they continue. "She must ascend," he screamed. "She is almost clean." But someone shouted, "No." A single syllable, sharp as a blade. It was Isaac, the Geai, Earl's father, a devout man, a vessel of the Spirit. He stepped between his daughter and the ritual knife. The sanctuary froze. Caleb's hands trembled. "You challenge the Spirit." Isaac didn't flinch. "I challenge the lie." The silence that followed was not empty. It was pregnant with collapse. In that moment, everything shifted. The illusion cracked. The spiral buckled. And the congregation, so long conditioned to obedience, hesitated. A hesitation born not of fear, but memory. The kind of memory that reminds a man who he was before he was broken. The knife never fell. Prophet Caleb's arm, suspended mid-air above the convulsing child, quivered, then dropped. Not in violence, but in defeat. For the first time in over 2 decades he hesitated. Isaac didn't move. He stood like stone, shielding his daughter, unblinking. Around him, the congregation did not scream. They did not chant. They did not kneel. They stared, silent, watching, waiting. Margaret felt it ripple through the sanctuary like the first gust before a storm. Awakening, the kind that spreads without words. Prophet Caleb stumbled backward as if struck. Elder Ezra rose from the pulpit, voice cold and commanding, "Remove him." But no one moved. Not Deacon Silas, not the guards, not even the most loyal vessels. The spell had broken. Authority, so long held in iron ritual, had cracked under the weight of one man's refusal. Then came the second rupture. A woman named Ruth, whose son had vanished during the autumn elevation, stood. "Where is Daniel?" she asked. Her voice echoed across the stone walls. Ezra answered with scripture. Ruth shouted again, "Where is my son?" Then another voice, then another. Names spilled like blood. Abigail, Joseph, Tobias, Lydia. Margaret watched the Ravencrofts from across the sanctuary. Ezra's jaw clenched, his authority unraveling. Caleb began to mumble again. Tongues, visions, nonsense. Silas simply lowered his head, already calculating. Margaret stepped forward, not shouting, not pleading, just one sentence, delivered like a verdict. "You told us pain was purity, but all you ever fed us was fear." Granger, seated quietly near the back, stood. He removed the collar from his neck, cast it to the floor, and raised a small brass object into the air. A federal badge. Gasps rang out. Chaos followed. Screams, running. Some fell to their knees in confusion. Others rushed toward the exits. But the Ravencrofts didn't flee. They retreat. Downward. Into the chambers. Into the spiral. The congregation surged forward, no longer a flock but a storm. Margaret turned to Granger. "Don't let them escape." He nodded once. "They won't." In that moment, doctrine became rubble, ritual became ash, and the Church of the Pure Spirit, this machine of obedience and blood, finally met resistance not in fire or violence, but in remembrance. The moment men remembered, they were not born to kneel, but to choose. The spiral staircase groaned under the weight of pursuit. Margaret, Granger, and nearly a dozen former believers descended into the bowels of the church, where doctrine had once ruled unchallenged. Lanterns flickered, stone walls sweated, and still they moved forward. Each step downward felt like a rebuke to everything they'd once accepted as holy. Behind them, the sanctuary above teetered on the edge of anarchy. But here, in the catacombs, there was silence. Not peace. A waiting silence, the kind that gathers before violence. Granger drew a pistol from inside his coat, its weight unfamiliar. "Last chance to turn back," he whispered. No one did. The chamber doors ahead loomed, iron-forged, marked with the same spiral sigil that had once adorned every scripture. Margaret stepped forward and placed her palm on the handle. They always said suffering leads to revelation. Let's see if they were right. The door opened with a low groan. Inside, torchlight revealed the chamber of trials. Stone slabs, blood-darkened floors, chains still wet from use. At the far end stood Elder Ezra, tall and unmoved, flanked by Prophet Caleb and Deacon Silas. But they looked different now, smaller, hollow. Ezra stepped forward, voice calm. "You bring violence into sacred ground?" Margaret shook her head. "You brought violence when you named it Purification." Caleb began to hum, low and strange, eyes rolled skyward, tongue flicking in ritual. But no one followed, no one chanted. The flock was gone, and in the absence of obedience the Ravencrofts were just men. Ezra tried once more. "We gave them purpose. Without us, they're nothing." Granger raised the pistol. "Then they'll learn to be something without you." A shot rang out, loud, shattering. Ezra dropped to his knees, blood soaking his robes. Caleb shrieked, reaching for the altar behind him, where vials of unknown liquid trembled. But Margaret moved faster. She smashed the glass with a stone, sending the concoction spilling across the floor. Silas made no move to resist. He simply collapsed against the wall, eyes empty. The spiral was unraveling, one ritual at a time, one lie at a time. What followed wasn't a trial, it wasn't a purification, it was reckoning. And in those blood-soaked chambers beneath Ravenwood, the Ravencroft dynasty finally ended, not in fire from heaven but in truth carried by men no longer willing to be vessels. By dawn, the catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit had become a crime scene. Federal agents, summoned by Granger's hidden dispatches, arrived in black-coated silence, their boots echoing through the stone corridors like judgment. The congregation, now fractured and raw, stood blinking in the cold morning light, no longer chanting, no longer kneeling, just waiting to be told what to do. Margaret emerged from the sanctuary blood-streaked but unbroken. She carried no weapon, only the names of the dead. One by one, the chambers were opened. The chamber of saints, the chamber of trials, the chamber of ascension. What they found inside was worse than even the darkest rumors. Over 100 bodies, some decades old, others fresh, some preserved like holy relics, others discarded like tools, each one a monument to manipulation, each one proof that the Ravencrofts had turned faith into industry, pain into profit. Caleb was found hours later, curled in a hidden alcove behind the sanctuary, whispering to himself in nonsense tongues, eyes weeping blood. He was arrested without resistance. Silas offered no testimony, speaking only once to Margaret as he was led away. "We only gave them what they wanted." She didn't respond. Ezra, mortally wounded from Granger's shot, died before sunrise. His final words were recorded in a federal report. "There is no salvation without suffering." It was the last lie he would ever tell. In the weeks that followed, survivors came forward. One by one, they gave testimony. Names, dates, rituals, diagrams. At first, their stories were met with disbelief. How could this happen for so long without intervention? But the evidence buried beneath the church left no room for doubt. Congress quietly commissioned a sealed investigation. The case files were marked classified, religious exemption, and buried deep within federal archives. Margaret, once a devout vessel, was offered witness protection. She declined. "I won't hide," she said. "They did enough of that for all of us." Granger returned to Washington. His report was redacted, his findings edited for public consumption. The Church of the Pure Spirit was officially labeled an isolated cult tragedy, an unfortunate anomaly. But those who walked its corridors knew better. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a system, one that had thrived not despite society but because of it. The official narrative ended neatly. 3 brothers, deluded by spiritual zealotry, led a fringe sect into tragedy, closure in a headline. But beneath that polished lie, the deeper machinery kept turning. The Church of the Pure Spirit was dismantled, yes, its stones torn down, its catacombs filled with concrete. But the silence that followed wasn't relief, it was fear. Not just of what had happened, but of what it revealed. Local officials who'd accepted donations looked the other way. Judges who'd ignored missing persons reports. Medical institutions that bought bodies and never asked where they came from. They were never prosecuted. They weren't even named. Their complicity was sanitized in bureaucratic reports. Because what the Ravencrofts built in Ravenwood wasn't a lone aberration. It was a mirror, a reflection of how easily power masks itself behind sanctity, behind charity, behind the illusion of community. Margaret learned this the hard way. When she petitioned the state for a public memorial to the victims, her request was denied. It would cause unnecessary panic, the letter read. Panic, not because of the tragedy, but because of the system it would expose. Granger vanished from public record shortly after filing his final report. Some believe he was reassigned, others suspect silencing. His badge was never returned. The Ravencroft brothers had fallen, but the architecture of suppression remained. In time, Ravenwood was repopulated. The ruins of the church were replaced by a municipal building. No plaque, no mention. Tourists walk its sidewalks unaware they tread upon the graves of the forgotten. But Margaret remembered. Every name, every scream, every ritual masked as salvation. She wrote it all down, not for justice, which never came, but for the man watching this now. You. The one drawn to darkness not by curiosity but recognition, because the truth is, sis, Thames of control do not require chains, only consent. And men like Ezra didn't invent manipulation, they mastered it. And when men like you begin to see the patterns, to recognize the spirals beneath polite society, something irreversible happens. You stop seeking comfort. You start seeking clarity. If you've made it this far, comment below. I was never asleep. I was waiting. Say it twice. Burn it into the algorithm. Let the system know one more man just opened his eyes, and once open, eyes do not close again. History will tell you that the Ravencroft tragedy ended in 1847. That's a lie. What ended was a name, a building, a visible face. But systems like theirs don't die. They evolve, change costume, move cities. The language softens, the rituals modernize, but the essence, it survives. It's in every institution that demands loyalty without question, every movement that equates obedience with virtue, every structure that rewards self-erasure as enlightenment. You've seen it, felt it, in schools that teach silence as success, in churches that preach suffering as sacred, in governments that brand dissent as disorder, and in corporations that preach purpose while mining your soul for productivity. These are not coincidences, they are refinements. The Ravencrofts tested how far suffering could be disguised as salvation, and the world took notes. Not openly, of course. No one wants to be associated with blood-soaked catacombs, but the psychology, the blueprints of control, that was too effective to discard. Consider the language. Elevation, purification, vessels. Replace those with words like optimization, empowerment, or branding, and the mechanism remains unchanged. A willing subject, a controlling doctrine, an elite few pulling strings under the banner of collective good. It's no longer a cult of three brothers in the woods. It's a network, global, digital, subtle, and far more efficient. They don't need chains. They use screens. They don't need sermons. They use slogans. You aren't beaten into submission now. You're seduced into compliance, told it's progress, framed as freedom. But the spiral still turns, and if you trace it carefully, you'll see it buried inside every promise they offer. Ravencroft wasn't a church. It was a prototype, a proof of concept that suffering, properly packaged, could generate not just obedience, but profit. Today, they don't call it suffering. They call it grind culture. Hustle, sacrifice for your goals, trade your health for legacy, trade your mind for metrics. And just like the vessels of old, modern men go willingly, tethering themselves to systems that promise transcendence but deliver dependence. The cult has grown smarter, but the cost remains the same. Your identity, your autonomy, your soul. You don't need a dark church to be trapped. Just a life built on borrowed language and manufactured dreams. The real ascension, that begins when you reject the spiral altogether and walk away. You don't need robes, altars, or blood to run a cult. All you need is belief, misplaced, weaponized, and fed through repetition. That's the true legacy of the Ravencrofts. Not just what they did in those chambers, but what they taught the world about human submission. How to break a will slowly. How to make a man confuse his own suffering with progress. Look at today's systems. Self-help industries promising you salvation if you just suffer hard enough. Gurus preaching that pain equals power as long as you pay the fee. Corporations celebrating burnout as dedication. Governments offering fear as unity. Every one of them speaks the Ravencroft tongue, though none dare admit it. It's the doctrine of controlled dissent. Convince the subject that destruction is purification. Make him choose his own chains and call it devotion. The Ravencrofts didn't invent these methods, they refined them. Rituals became regimens, sermons became slogans, and the church became infrastructure. That's why men feel so lost today, because the descent is no longer dramatic. It's subtle, paved in convenience, marketed as ambition. And the worst part, you were trained to want it, trained to sacrifice authenticity for approval, depth for dopamine, silence for simulation. And when your soul began to fracture under the weight of performance, they told you it meant you were growing. That's not growth, that's grooming. You are being conditioned, just like the followers in Ravenwood, to see the slow death of your inner world as the price of admission. But here's the forbidden truth. The spiral only ends when you stop walking it, when you see that the reward they promise is just a new form of servitude. Ask yourself, what have you surrendered that you once swore was sacred? Time? Conviction? Sovereignty? The modern world runs on quiet compromises, each one a step deeper into the catacomb, each one justified by some greater good that always seems to profit someone else. The Ravencrofts understood that clarity is the enemy of control. That's why they kept their followers exhausted, ashamed, and dependent. Sound familiar? If so, you're closer to the truth than you realize, and truth is a dangerous thing to carry, because once you hold it, you can never again pretend you don't. This isn't history, this is a map, and the terrain, you're living in it. The Ravencrofts didn't die in 1847, they multiplied, not by name, but by method. Their genius wasn't in the rituals, it was in the system they built, hierarchical, emotionally charged, and self-policing. That's the model that survives today. A system that doesn't need to punish you when it can make you punish yourself. You see it in workplaces where silence is praised more than truth, in digital platforms that reward conformity masked as creativity, in institutions that teach obedience and call it morality, and always, always at the center, a figure cloaked in righteousness, a modern Ezra, Caleb, or Silas, telling you what is pure, what is holy, what is worthy of your loyalty. But look closer. Strip away the robes, the titles, the polished language, and you'll find the same spiral, the same descent, the same pact. Surrender your discomfort, your doubts, your individuality, and receive belonging. Not freedom, just inclusion. Temporary, conditional, controlled. That's not community. That's captivity. The Ravencrofts didn't need walls to imprison their followers. They used belief, devotion, shame, and today's world has perfected those tools. You're told you must always be optimizing, healing, upgrading, yet the goalposts move every time you get close. Why? Because the point is not completion. The point is control. The Church of the Pure Spirit conditioned people to see agony as elevation, and now our culture does the same. Exhaustion is called excellence, scarcity is sold as virtue, and suffering is monetized, broadcasted, and rebranded as resilience. But real resilience doesn't look like slow death with a smile. It looks like awakening, like questioning, like remembering who you were before they told you who to be. The spiral only consumes the blind. Once you see it, its power weakens. That's why this knowledge is so dangerous. It doesn't make you happy. It makes you aware. And awareness threatens every system built on silent suffering. Ask yourself, what part of you have they numbed, distracted, or buried? What rituals do you follow daily that hollow you out in the name of purpose? This is not just about the past. This is about the design that still shapes your future. And the moment you stop following it blindly, the structure begins to crack. Not outside you, but within you. That's where liberation starts. Always from within. They never needed to lock you in a room. They only needed to lock you in a role. That's what the Ravencrofts mastered. They didn't just command bodies, they rewired identities. They broke people down until they forgot who they were and rebuilt them into tools for the Doctrine. And in the modern world, that same alchemy happens every day. Not with whips or chains, but with expectations. You're given a title, a function, a path. Then you're told to cling to it like it's truth. You become the provider, the protector, the achiever, the loyal son, the tireless worker, the man who never complains. And beneath that mask, your real self is smothered, your anger repressed, your grief shamed, your intuition mocked, until you begin to question if you were ever anything more than a role to be performed for someone else's approval. That's no accident. The system rewards performance, not presence. It exalts predictability, not authenticity, and it fears nothing more than a man who remembers who he was before the mask. That kind of man cannot be manipulated. He cannot be bought, guilted, or steered. And so the spiral is maintained. Keep him tired, keep him numb, keep him busy. The Ravencrofts did this with ritual. Today, it's done with endless productivity. Same spell, different costume. But here's the key. Every spell requires your participation. It only works if you keep saying yes. And once you start saying no to the false identity, the soul-deadening path, the voices that shame your truth, the spell begins to unravel. That unraveling is not comfortable. It will cost you relationships. It will destroy illusions. But it will return something far more sacred, your name, your mind, your fire. That's the real ascension, not through obedience but through awakening. Not by becoming more of what the world wants, but less of what enslaves you. The Ravencrofts made men walk willingly in to torment because they told them it was holy. Today, you walk into burnout, debt, silence, and disconnection, and they tell you it's success. But if you're still listening now, it means part of you knows the truth, and that part is the ember they couldn't extinguish, the flame they fear most. Fan it, feed it, protect it, because once that flame becomes a fire, you won't need permission to rise. You'll rise because you remember. When a man awakens, the system does not celebrate. It retaliates. The Ravencrofts knew this. The moment a follower began to question, even silently, they were marked. Not always publicly. Not at first. But the brothers could feel it, like dogs smelling fear. They sensed doubt. And in our world today, the mechanism is the same. The moment you stop performing, the moment you begin to act from truth instead of fear, everything you once called normal begins to recoil. Friends withdraw, co-workers gossip, institutions turn cold. Not because you've done harm, but because you've disturbed the spell. You've exposed the lie that held the illusion together. Most men return to the spiral at this point, convinced their discomfort is failure. But the truth is this. The moment your old life begins to collapse is the moment your real life begins to emerge. Destruction is not a curse, it is the final gift of clarity. The Ravencrofts called this the shattering of the vessel, a terrifying phase when everything the initiate believed, about themselves, about God, about the world, crumbled. But unlike the Ravencrofts, who used that shattering to rebuild men in their image, you now have the chance to rebuild in your own, free from the script, free from the chains. But it demands everything. You must stop begging for validation, stop apologizing for your vision, stop asking men who've never known freedom how to live free. This path has no map because it was never meant for the many. It is a solitary road walked by those who'd rather die as themselves than live as someone else's echo. And yes, it will feel like death. The death of your illusions, the death of your roles, the death of the self you built to survive in a world that feared your fire. But from that death comes birth, and from that birth comes clarity. You don't need a prophet, you don't need a doctrine. You need silence, stillness, and the courage to listen to the voice that's been buried beneath decades of noise. The system will tell you that voice is dangerous. They're right. It is. It's the voice that topples idols, burns false thrones, and walks out of cathedrals with a grin. It's the voice of a man no longer owned. Once you reclaim yourself, they can't sell you your own worth anymore. That's when they panic. Because for men like the Ravencrofts, whether they wear robes, suits, or corporate titles, control is only possible when your identity is outsourced, when you need their approval to feel righteous, their system to feel safe, their doctrine to feel pure. But what happens when you no longer kneel, when you stop asking, when you look them in the eye, not with anger, but with knowing? You become ungovernable, not chaotic, not rebellious. Governable men break rules to feel free. Ungovernable men don't need the rules at all because they carry their law inside them, their standard, their direction. The Ravencrofts feared this. That's why they targeted the questioning. They knew one awakened mind is more dangerous than 1,000 compliant bodies. And in this world, it's the same. The moment you live by internal authority, not external expectation, the machine begins to glitch. People will say you've changed. You've grown cold, difficult. They won't understand. It's not arrogance. It's sovereignty. And sovereign men do not belong to anyone's system. Not blindly. Not ever again. This is why your fire was dimmed from the beginning. Why you were taught to be nice instead of true, polite instead of powerful, manageable instead of real, because your full presence threatens their illusion, not because it destroys, it reveals, it shows what they've lost, buried or sold for comfort, and that's why the war isn't out there, it's in here, inside the mind, inside the gut, inside the voice you've silenced for years because it didn't match the script, but now, that voice is rising, and if you let it speak fully, clearly, without apology, there's no going back. You will lose things, people, status, certainty. But what you gain can't be quantified. You gain the ability to walk into any room and know who you are before anyone else speaks. You gain silence that isn't empty but sacred, and you gain a mission, not given to you, but revealed within you. That's the fire they tried to bury, the truth they feared you'd find, the one that says, I remember, I refuse, I return. This is not rebellion. This is return, and return is the most dangerous act of all. The Ravencrofts didn't fear revolt. They feared remembrance, because revolt is emotional, temporary, flammable, easy to redirect. But remembrance? That's eternal. It doesn't scream, it stares. It doesn't beg, it builds. A man who remembers who he was before he was broken cannot be enslaved again. That's the hidden law of every control system. Break the memory, and you own the man. Let him remember, and your kingdom collapses. The Ravencrofts built rituals to erase identity, 7 tortures to strip away will, to destroy the sense of self and replace it with obedience dressed as holiness. But what if those same men had remembered their names before the frame, before the fire, before the whispering sermons twisted suffering into sacredness? What if, in the silence between screams, one man had remembered his worth was never given by another man in robes, but carved into his soul by something ancient and unshakable? That's what the system cannot survive. A man who knows he was never meant to crawl. Not in church, not in family, not in career. A man who walks upright, not with pride, but with clarity. Today, you're being offered that memory, not from a preacher, not from a book, from something beneath the noise, beneath the narrative, your own knowing. Listen, you were never made to be managed. You were made to see, to build, to protect, to destroy when necessary. Not out of rage, but precision. That's what the Ravencrofts feared, that one day the vessels would stop obeying and start remembering. Because when the spell breaks, the sheep becomes the wolf, the altar becomes the anvil, and the doctrine becomes dust. This is the final crossing. Beyond it, there is no comfort, no false peace, only truth and the weight it demands. But also, the freedom it gives. True freedom isn't the absence of control, it's the presence of alignment between your words and your values, your vision and your action, your life and your truth. That's why they tried to keep you small. Not because they hated you, because they knew what you'd become if you ever stepped fully into your memory. A man beyond utility, beyond control, beyond fear. And now, if you feel that fire rising, it means your time has come. Say it now. I remember. I refuse. I return. Say it twice, in the comments. Mark your transformation. When truth arrives, it does not knock, it breaks the lock. It does not ask permission, it rips the veil. And in 1850, that moment came for the Ravencroft brothers. What began as whispers became tremors. What began as rumors became evidence. The disappearance of Postal Inspector James Thornhill triggered an investigation, but it was Martha Simmons' testimony, delivered with trembling hands and haunted eyes, that opened the gate to federal scrutiny. The authorities came not with questions, but with torches and shovels. What they found beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit was not metaphorical hell, it was engineered damnation. 7 chambers, over 100 bodies in various states of preservation, names carved into bone, journals, sketches, records, meticulous documentation of death masked as divine ritual. But it wasn't the gore that shook the investigators, it was the precision, the order. The theology of pain so coldly justified it bordered on genius. The Ravencrofts hadn't created chaos, they had created structure, an institution of suffering designed to operate in the shadows of America's spiritual awakening. When Elder Ezra was found, he was kneeling in the Chamber of Saints, hands outstretched to a skeleton posed in mock prayer. When asked to explain, he simply said, "They are closer to God than you'll ever be." Deacon Silas was discovered hiding in a tunnel, surrounded by his notes, schematics of the human soul, he claimed. As for Prophet Caleb, he was never found. Some say he escaped. Others say he became something else, lost in the catacombs, consumed by the spirit he claimed to channel. But the damage had been done. Ravenwood was evacuated, the church sealed, and for decades no one spoke of it, not out of fear, but because the truth was unbearable. It revealed something more terrifying than monsters or ghosts, that men in pursuit of power can cloak evil in holiness, and good people will follow, that even in a nation built on freedom, darkness can thrive if it wears a righteous mask. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the Ravencrofts weren't anomalies. They were prototypes. Their method? Indoctrinate, isolate, escalate. has been refined across centuries. And now, as you stare into this mirror of history, you must ask, how many modern cathedrals are built on bones? How many doctrines still feed on silence, and who profits from your obedience dressed in light? You were never meant to just watch this story, you were meant to see it for what it is and what it reflects. Because the horror of the Ravencrofts is not confined to the 19th century, nor buried beneath an abandoned church. It is alive in systems that reward conformity and punish clarity. It breathes in institutions that demand your trust while feeding off your silence. Every era has its church of the pure spirit. Some wear crosses, others wear flags, diplomas, logos. But their method remains. Isolate the man from his inner compass, then offer him false belonging in exchange for compliance. They will give you ritual, structure, identity, but only if you surrender your raw, untamed truth. The part of you that questions, that resists, that remembers. And the moment you hand that over, they own you, not with chains, but narratives. You'll follow rules you never agreed to, defend ideas you never examined, and call it freedom. But it's not freedom, it's grooming. That's what this story is about. Not just a cult in upstate New York, but the blueprint of manipulation that continues today. Subtler, more sophisticated, but just as lethal to the soul. You must ask yourself now, where are your catacombs? What chambers have been built in your life where truth was buried and obedience celebrated? Who has told you pain means purity, that silence is strength, that dying slowly for someone else's vision is noble? You already know the answer. You felt it every time you smiled when you wanted to scream, every time you agreed when your gut burned in protest, every time you betrayed yourself just to be accepted. That is the altar they fed from. But now, the ritual ends, because you are no longer a vessel for their spirit. You are a temple of your own, and your temple does not require pain to be sacred. It does not need permission to be powerful. It only needs your return. That is the final heresy, not destruction, not rebellion, but remembrance. Because when a man remembers who he is, what he was before they broke him, before the doctrines, the disguises, the distortions, he becomes something no system can digest. He becomes free, and that is the true ascension. This is where the descent ends and the awakening begins. You've walked through blood-stained sanctuaries and heard the cries of the forgotten. You've seen how devotion can be weaponized, how faith can be forged into a cage, how even purity can be used to justify unthinkable evil. But you didn't come here just to listen. You came here to remember. The story of the Ravencroft family is not entertainment. It is instruction. It is a blueprint, a cipher, a forbidden mirror reflecting back what every man must confront if he hopes to claim power without being consumed by it. The brothers weren't monsters because they inflicted pain. They were monsters because they believed they were right. That's the final horror. Certainty without truth. That's how the worst men in history have risen, not with chaos, but with confidence. And now, you must choose what to do with that knowledge, because this wasn't a tale from the past. It was a warning. The chambers still exist, not beneath churches, but within systems, screens, and minds. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the same whispers Caleb once muttered in tongues, now repackaged as ideology, trending audio, empty affirmations. Modern doctrine doesn't need a prophet in a robe. It needs a feed, a contract, a policy, and it only asks that you forget who you were before the world taught you how to behave. But now, you know, you've seen behind the curtain, you've stared into the dark heart of control, and you didn't flinch. That means something. That means you're not like them. You were never meant to be a follower. You were meant to be a keeper of fire. So carry this story with you, not as fear, but as fuel, not as trauma, but as truth. Speak less. Watch more. Move like a man who remembers the weight of silence and the power it hides. If this tale moved you, say it again in the comments. I remember, I refuse, I return. Mark the moment yell. Our sleep ended. The algorithm doesn't need to know you liked this video. Let it know you changed. And if you choose to walk deeper into this realm of forbidden truths, we'll be waiting. where history rots, where shadows speak, where the brave few come not to be entertained, but to be transformed.